The quiet of the morning was suddenly shattered by a frantic call to 911. On the other end of the line was a man's voice, shaking with panic. It was Joe. His words came out jumbled, but the desperation in his tone was unmistakable. He already knew. Something terrible had happened. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but there was nothing they could do except confirm Joe's worst fear. Katie was dead. And worst of all, the circumstances surrounding her death made one thing painfully clear. This was no accident. It wasn't natural causes. At first glance, everything in the bedroom seemed tidy, but one detail stood out. A large jewelry box was left open, its drawers pulled out, and several pieces were missing. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. Kathy Blair was born on May 31, 1961, in the sunny and vibrant state of California. She was raised in a warm and nurturing household, the kind where laughter filled the kitchen and family dinners were a sacred tradition. Her parents, both devoted and supportive, worked hard to provide a stable life for their children. Kathy grew up alongside her brother and sister, creating bonds and memories that would last a lifetime. Even as a child, she had a special spark, something that made her stand out. It wasn't just her infectious smile or kind heart, though she had both. It was her voice. From a young age, Kathy gravitated toward music. It wasn't something she just liked. It was something she felt. The notes and rhythms seemed to live inside her. Whether she was humming softly at home or belting out tunes at school events, music became the language through which she expressed her joy, her sorrow, and everything in between. While her siblings pursued different paths, Kathy's heart was already set. Music was not just her passion, it was her calling. By the time she was ready for college, there was no question in her mind about what direction she would take. Kathy chose to enroll at the University of Texas, a place where she could not only refine her vocal skills, but immerse herself in the rich, creative atmosphere of Austin, a city that embraced artists and dreamers. She studied vocal performance with the same determination and grace that had always defined her. And Austin quickly became more than just a temporary home. It was where her dreams began to take shape. After graduating, Kathy poured herself into a career as a music teacher and Christian choir director. Her deep love for music was matched only by her passion for teaching. She had a special gift. Not only could she sing beautifully, but she could make others believe they could too. Her students adored her, and their parents respected her. Many would say that Kathy had a way of lighting up a room just by walking into it. Her energy was contagious, and her belief in the power of music to uplift and heal made her a beloved figure in the community. Over the years, Kathy experienced the highs and lows that life often brings. She was married twice, and though both marriages ended in divorce, she remained resilient and focused. Her greatest pride and joy came from raising her 2 children, a son and a daughter, who she lovingly supported through every chapter of their lives. She was a devoted mother, always present, always encouraging, and always reminding them to chase their dreams with the same fearless heart she had. By 2013, Kathy was 52 and embracing a new phase of life. Her children were now grown and building lives of their own, and she found herself searching for a place where she could enjoy a bit more peace and independence. That's when she moved into a charming home in a quiet, safe suburb of Austin. The neighborhood was picturesque. Tree-lined streets, friendly neighbors, and a sense of calm that made it feel like the perfect retreat. For Kathy, this wasn't just a house. It was a dream fulfilled. A place to continue teaching, to direct her choir, and to finally enjoy the sanctuary she had longed for. In December 2014, just before the holidays, Kathy's son Joe, then 23 and serving in the military, came home to spend a few weeks with her before his next deployment. Their time together was precious. Joe had always been close to his mom, and the visit was a chance for both of them to reconnect, relax, and enjoy the simple joys of being home. On the evening of December 5th, Joe went out to see some friends. It was supposed to be a normal night. Nothing out of the ordinary. He returned home late the next morning, the sun already high in the sky. As he walked through the front door, he called out for his mother, expecting to hear her cheerful voice. But the house was eerily quiet. A deep sense of unease crept in as he moved from room to room. When he reached her bedroom, what he discovered would forever change his life. Kathy was gone. The sight was so jarring, so unexpected, that it took a moment for the shock to wear off. But instinct kicked in. Joe immediately ran outside and dialed 911, his voice trembling with panic. Emergency responders arrived swiftly, but the scene they encountered confirmed what Joe already knew. Kathy had passed several hours earlier, and this was no natural death. The evidence made one thing heartbreakingly clear. This was a homicide. Investigators wasted no time. The bedroom became a critical piece of the puzzle. A large jewelry box sat open, its drawers pulled out and some contents missing. Pieces were scattered across the floor in what looked like a hurried attempt to take valuable items. Initially, this pointed to a robbery. But almost as quickly, doubts began to form. Detectives took note of what wasn't missing. Kathy's laptop, her cell phone, and other valuable electronics had been left untouched. There were no signs of a forced entry at the front of the house. However, the back door was unlocked. When questioned, Joe explained that his mother often left that door open, a habit born from trust in her quiet, close-knit neighborhood. It didn't make sense. Most robberies happen during the day, when homes are empty. This break-in had occurred at night, in one of the city's safest areas, and the timeline didn't add up either. Evidence on the jewelry box and nearby surfaces suggested the attacker had harmed Kathy before touching anything of value. That chilling detail led investigators to suspect a far more disturbing possibility, that the break-in had been staged to cover something up. What if the theft was just a distraction? This theory opened up a new and unsettling line of questioning. Could the person responsible have known Kathy? Was it someone who had visited the home before? Someone who knew about the unlocked door? The absence of any signs of struggle suggested the attacker may have moved quickly, with intent and knowledge of the home's layout. Despite a thorough investigation, forensic experts were unable to retrieve any fingerprints, hair samples, or usable DNA. The only physical clue left behind was a partial shoe print found near the bed, a faint imprint that, while helpful, wasn't enough to immediately identify a suspect. That one detail only deepened investigators' belief that this was no random break-in gone wrong. It felt too deliberate, too calculated, and it reinforced an increasingly disturbing theory. Faced with an unsettling crime scene and no obvious forensic trail to follow, detectives decided to pivot. If they couldn't rely on physical evidence, they would have to focus on relationships. The question they asked themselves was simple yet critical. Who would want to hurt Kathy Blair? They began to closely examine the people in her life. The ones who knew her best. The ones who had access. The ones who may have had motives that weren't immediately obvious. Naturally, they began with her immediate family, including her son Joe. After all, he had been staying in the house and had both proximity and opportunity. While the very idea was difficult to entertain, especially given the emotional trauma he was clearly experiencing, detectives had to be thorough. They questioned him carefully and reviewed his timeline. Joe told them he had spent the entire night out with friends, and officers followed up on every detail. Phone records, witness statements, and even video surveillance from a nearby gas station confirmed his alibi. Every piece of evidence aligned perfectly. With that, Joe was ruled out as a suspect. Next, investigators turned to Kathy's broader social circle. They spoke with friends, co-workers, neighbors, and members of her choir. They hoped to uncover any hidden tension, past arguments, or long-standing feuds. But time and again, they heard the same thing. Kathy was universally loved. Her students admired her. Her fellow musicians respected her. Friends described her as warm, generous, and deeply committed to her work and her faith. Just when it looked like the trail had gone cold, detectives received a piece of information that shifted the investigation in a new direction. Several of Kathy's close friends had mentioned something that stood out. Kathy had often spoken about her second ex-husband. Although they had divorced 4 years prior, the separation had been anything but peaceful. According to Kathy's friends, the relationship had turned volatile in the final stages. She had even expressed fear that he might follow her or try to contact her after the divorce. She told at least 2 friends that she didn't want him to know where she had moved. That detail was alarming and significant. Intrigued and concerned, detectives tracked the man down. He was living just outside of Austin, not too far from Kathy's new home. When police arrived to speak with him, his reaction was frankly puzzling. Upon hearing Kathy's name and being informed of her death, his immediate response was not one of confusion or sorrow. That strange an assumption immediately raised suspicions. Investigators pressed further, asking about his whereabouts on the night of December 5th. The man claimed he had gone on a short solo trip and was staying in his RV at the time. He offered up the RV for a search without hesitation, which only added to the mixed signals he was giving. Detectives combed through the vehicle but came up empty-handed. No weapons, no clothing that matched the suspect description. While his behavior was certainly strange and his statement unnerving, there simply wasn't anything concrete tying him to the scene. With no hard evidence, police had to let him go. He remained in their sights, but without any proof, they had to keep casting a wider net. Then, just a few days later, the investigation took another unexpected and eerie turn. One of Kathy's close friends reached out to police with something unsettling. She had helped organize a memorial service for Kathy, a small and heartfelt gathering of people who had known and loved her. But during the service, something odd occurred. A man, completely unfamiliar to everyone present, stood up and began to speak. From the moment he opened his mouth, people were uneasy. His speech felt off. His tone was strange, his words disjointed. It wasn't grief. It wasn't fond remembrance. It was something else. And the most bizarre part? Nobody knew who he was. These weren't casual acquaintances in the room. These were Kathy's closest friends, people who had known her for years. Yet not a single one of them recognized this man. His stories about Kathy didn't align with reality. He spoke in vague generalities, as though he was improvising or pulling information from public sources rather than from personal memory. The strange incident nagged at investigators. Curious, they followed up and eventually identified the man as a sales clerk who worked at a women's clothing store in the area. When questioned, the man readily admitted he had never met Kathy. He told police he had read about the murder in the news and felt compelled to attend the service because he was moved by the story. He claimed his intention had been to honor her. His explanation, though unsettling, didn't break any laws. And again, there was no direct link to Kathy, no motive, and no evidence of involvement. He was released. Once again, the case returned to a standstill. But just as the momentum seemed lost, an unexpected call came in. A man named Rob reached out to the police saying he had something they might want to see, something unusual. Rob was an outdoor enthusiast who had recently purchased a high-tech thermal imaging scope. This scope had the ability to record video footage, even in low-light conditions. Eager to test it out, Rob had gone for an early morning walk on December 6th in a wooded area near his home. As he wandered through the trees, he watched the surroundings through the scope, just getting used to its features. That's when something strange caught his attention. He noticed a car driving slowly down a nearby road. It didn't speed by like most morning commuters. Instead, it crept along before finally pulling over to the side. A few moments later, a man stepped out and walked away from the vehicle, disappearing into a quiet side street that, according to Rob, led in the general direction of Kathy Blair's neighborhood. At the time, Rob thought little of it. Maybe the man was just taking a walk. Maybe he lived nearby. But after hearing the news about Kathy's death later that day, he remembered the odd encounter. That's when he remembered his thermal camera had been recording the entire time. He went back and reviewed the footage. And there it was, clear as day in the thermal recording. The figure of a man, tall and broad-shouldered, stepping out of a vehicle and walking down a quiet street under the cover of night. The man's outline was sharp, his posture firm, and there was something distinct about his stride, a purposeful gait, almost like he knew exactly where he was headed. It wasn't random. It didn't look like someone out for a stroll. It looked like intent. Rob immediately contacted the police and handed over the footage. Investigators were intrigued. Finally, something that could move the investigation forward. But there was a catch. Because the footage had been recorded using a thermal imaging device, it only captured the man's silhouette. There were no facial features, no hair or clothing details, no license plate on the vehicle. Identifying the individual from the video would be extremely difficult, if not impossible. Still, all hope was not lost. Detectives focused on what they could gather. The man's general height, his build, and most importantly, his walk, something often unique to an individual. And then there was the vehicle. Although the thermal scope hadn't captured a license plate, the shape, size, and heat signature of the car were distinct enough to allow investigators to narrow it down to a few possible models. This opened up a small but potentially crucial window of opportunity. The team compared the thermal silhouette to their two leading persons of interest, Kathy's second ex-husband and the strange man who had shown up at her memorial. But the comparisons didn't line up. The ex-husband was shorter and stockier, and his car didn't match the vehicle seen in the footage. As for the memorial attendee, his physical characteristics didn't fit either, and he didn't drive a car resembling the one caught on camera. It was frustrating. The footage provided a glimpse into what may have been the killer's escape, or possibly arrival, but didn't give them a name. Detectives had no choice but to dig deeper. They reviewed the video frame by frame, again and again, hoping to extract even the smallest additional detail. But despite their best efforts, they found nothing new. For the time being, the case returned to a painful standstill. Then, December 15, 10 days after Kathy's tragic death. That morning, a caretaker arrived to check on an elderly couple, Billy and Sydney Shelton. She visited them regularly to help with light cleaning, errands, and companionship. But as she approached the front of the house, she noticed something was wrong. The front door was ajar, and there were visible signs of damage around the lock, like someone had forced their way in. With growing dread, she stepped inside. The house was eerily quiet. Moving cautiously down the hallway, she eventually reached the bedroom, and what she saw inside shook her to the core. She immediately backed out of the house and called the police, her voice trembling with panic. When officers arrived, they were struck by a chilling sense of déjà vu. The bedroom bore a disturbing resemblance to the scene they had encountered at Kathy Blair's home. Just like before, the jewelry box had been emptied. Drawers were pulled out and scattered across the floor, their contents missing. And once again, the rest of the home appeared untouched. Electronics, cash, personal valuables, all left behind. The similarities were far too precise to ignore. Both incidents had occurred at night while the victims were likely asleep. Both homes had been targeted for jewelry, and both were located just 15 minutes apart in quiet Austin suburbs. It was no longer a question of coincidence. The evidence suggested something far more disturbing, a potential pattern. Initially, investigators had leaned toward the theory that Kathy's murder had been personal, committed by someone she knew, someone with a grudge. But the Shelton case forced them to reevaluate. Billy and Sydney were a gentle, elderly couple with no known enemies. There was no apparent motive. There were no links between them and Kathy, no shared social circles, no common acquaintances, no places they had both frequented. Their lives had never intersected. That could only mean one thing. He was selecting homes, situations, vulnerable people. Detectives were now looking at the horrifying possibility that this was the work of a serial offender, someone who moved through neighborhoods undetected. This wasn't just about solving a murder anymore. It was a race to prevent the next one. Police redoubled their efforts. They returned to the victims' neighborhoods, going door to door, re-interviewing everyone who had known Kathy, Billy, or Sydney. They urged the public to come forward with any tip, no matter how small, no matter how seemingly insignificant. And finally, that persistence paid off. One of Kathy's longtime friends reached out. She remembered a conversation she had with Kathy just a few months before the murder, something that hadn't seemed especially important at the time, but now stood out like a flashing light. Kathy had mentioned that a handyman had come by her house, sent by her landlord to fix a few things. The man had done a poor job, but that wasn't what had bothered her. She had described his behavior as odd, unsettling even. She hadn't been able to put her finger on it, but something about him had made her uncomfortable. Following this new lead, detectives contacted Kathy's landlord and asked for the name of the contractor. After a bit of digging, they found it: Timothy Parlin. Timothy was a local resident with a record that raised immediate concern. His background check revealed a long list of prior arrests, but there was a consistent pattern. He targeted homes, specifically homes with accessible jewelry. Theft, burglary, breaking, and entering. Jewelry was always the common thread. At the time, Timothy had been out on parole, living in a long-stay hotel not far from either crime scene. When officers arrived and asked to speak with him, Timothy didn't resist. He agreed to answer a few questions, but notably refused to let them into his room. Instead, he insisted on stepping outside to talk in the hotel parking lot, a small decision, but one that raised a subtle red flag. Why didn't he want them to see his living space? What was he hiding? At first, the conversation was casual. When asked about Kathy, Timothy initially claimed he didn't remember her at all. But as detectives provided more details, her neighborhood, the timing of the work, the nature of the job, his memory suddenly returned. He admitted to doing some repairs at her home, but was quick to emphasize that he hadn't had any further contact and certainly had nothing to do with her tragic death. In fact, he claimed he had an alibi. On the night, he said, he had been working a night shift at a local convenience store. A straightforward story. Too straightforward, perhaps. But even as he spoke, detectives noted an important physical discrepancy. Timothy didn't match the profile captured in the thermal imaging footage recorded by Rob just hours after Kathy's murder. The silhouette in the video appeared taller, broader, and moved with a very different gait. Moreover, Timothy's personal vehicle didn't match the heat signature or general shape of the car seen in the thermal video. The differences were significant. These details didn't exonerate him, but they certainly complicated things. With no solid physical evidence tying Timothy to the crime at that moment, detectives had no choice but to let him go, at least temporarily. They left the hotel empty-handed, but with a nagging feeling that the story wasn't over. Then, as often happens in complex investigations, the truth began to unravel not because of what the suspect said, but because of what he lied about. As part of their routine verification, detectives followed up on Timothy's alibi. When they called the convenience store where he claimed to be working the night of the murder, they learned that Timothy hadn't been employed there in over a week. In fact, he had been fired days before Kathy's death. His carefully crafted story had just fallen apart. Alarmed by the discovery, detectives rushed back to the hotel to confront him, but when they arrived, it was too late. Timothy was gone. Instead, his wife answered the door. She seemed nervous but cooperative. She allowed the officers to search the room, and it was during that search that detectives found something that would finally shift the investigation toward resolution: a pawn shop receipt. The date on the receipt matched the date of Kathy's murder. More specifically, the timestamp indicated that the items had been sold just hours after she was killed. The listed items? Several pieces of jewelry. Detectives took the receipt and immediately headed to the pawn shop to investigate further. Once there, the pieces started falling into place. The pawn shop owner allowed detectives to examine the items sold by Timothy. And one by one, they were able to confirm that the jewelry belonged to Kathy Blair. Her children were brought in to identify some of the pieces, and they immediately recognized items their mother had cherished. But that wasn't all. Security cameras at the pawn shop had also captured footage of the transaction, along with the vehicle Timothy had arrived in. It wasn't the car registered to his name. This one belonged to his sister, and, critically, the car bore a strong resemblance to the one seen on Rob's thermal footage. Similar body style, similar size. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was close. That was enough to secure a search warrant for the vehicle. Forensic experts conducted a meticulous sweep of the car, and the results were damning. On the passenger seat and the floorboard, investigators discovered trace evidence, microscopic material that was later tested and confirmed to be Kathy's DNA. The scientific analysis left no room for doubt. This car had been used in connection with the crime. With this critical evidence in hand, police arrested Timothy Parlin and brought him in for a formal interrogation. But what happened next only deepened the mystery. Timothy, even when confronted with the jewelry, the pawnshop footage, and the forensic evidence from the vehicle, refused to confess. He remained eerily calm and repeated a phrase over and over again. "These hands have never killed anyone." The line became a mantra, one that struck detectives as both calculated and strangely rehearsed. It was as if Timothy believed that denying involvement, no matter how overwhelming the evidence, would somehow make it untrue. But then, after hours of questioning, a shift occurred. Not a confession, but a deflection. Timothy claimed he hadn't committed the crime himself. Instead, he said he knew who had. According to him, the person responsible was a man named Shawn. Shawn Benel Kassar. Detectives were immediately skeptical. The timing of the accusation, the vagueness of the details, and the strength of the case already built against Timothy made the story seem like a desperate attempt to redirect blame. Still, due diligence required that they follow the lead. They ran a background check on Shawn and were surprised by what they found. At 30 years old, Shawn was a former science teacher with a degree in microbiology. He had no criminal record and, most oddly of all, he lived several hundred miles away from Austin. On the surface, he seemed like the unlikeliest of suspects. But detectives wanted to be absolutely certain. They traveled to his town to speak with him directly, and the moment they sat down, the case took another unexpected turn. Shawn acknowledged knowing Timothy. He said they had met a few months prior and described Timothy as strange, someone who made him uncomfortable. According to Shawn, they hadn't maintained regular contact. But then, almost offhandedly, he dropped a detail that caught detectives completely off guard. He had been in Austin on the night. Not only that, he had stayed at Timothy's place during that time. The coincidence was alarming. At first, Shawn claimed that Timothy had left the house late that night without saying anything. But moments later, his story shifted. Now he admitted they had gone to Kathy's neighborhood together. According to him, Timothy had exited the vehicle alone and returned just minutes later with a bag. When Shawn looked inside, he saw it was filled with jewelry. Shawn insisted he had no knowledge of Timothy's intentions, had never planned to be involved, and was horrified by what had happened. As the interview continued and detectives carefully navigated their questions, Shawn remained relatively calm, offering answers that were measured, though increasingly inconsistent. Then, in a moment that would shift the course of the interrogation, Shawn asked if he could use the restroom. That's when something unexpected happened. As Shawn walked down the hallway, the investigator who had reviewed Rob's thermal footage from the night of Kathy's murder felt an unsettling jolt of recognition. Shawn's gait, the rhythm of his steps, the sway of his shoulders, even the way he carried his weight, was nearly identical to the figure seen walking away from the vehicle on the thermal video. Up until that point, Shawn had appeared to be a reluctant witness. Someone pulled into a situation he hadn't fully understood. But now, that perception shifted. When Shawn returned from the restroom, the tone of the questioning shifted. Detectives challenged him more directly, poking holes in his previous statements. They laid out a new theory, that perhaps Timothy had forced him into the house against his will. It was a calculated psychological move. Their goal was to dislodge his story without accusing him outright. The pressure worked. Shawn hesitated. His eyes dropped. He fidgeted with his hands. Then, in a subdued voice, he admitted something new. He had entered Kathy's house alone. According to his revised account, the plan had always been a simple burglary. He claimed Timothy stayed behind in the car while he slipped in through the unlocked back door. He wandered quietly through the home, searching for anything of value. That's when he noticed the jewelry box on the dresser. At first, Shawn insisted that he never meant to hurt anyone. In his version of events, he left without waking Kathy, returned to the car, and said nothing. He even speculated that Timothy might have re-entered the home after he left. But detectives were far from convinced. They already knew that evidence had been found on and near the jewelry box. This meant the box had only been disturbed after not before. Shawn's story simply didn't line up with the timeline or forensic findings. Eventually, the weight of the truth became too heavy to carry. In a low voice, barely audible at first, Shawn admitted that it was him. It was a chilling admission, and one that finally gave detectives what they needed to move forward. Though the confession was significant, investigators still had concerns. The story seemed incomplete, and parts of it felt crafted to minimize Shawn's responsibility. Still, it was enough for an arrest. To bolster their case further, detectives took Shawn's shoes and sent them for forensic analysis. The goal: compare them to the partial footprint left behind in Kathy's bedroom. The results came back quickly, and they were decisive. The pattern on the sole of Shawn's shoe matched the print found at the scene. The dimensions were exact. The wear patterns aligned. But the case wasn't over. Detectives still had one major concern: the second crime, the home invasion of Billy and Sydney Shelton. When they asked Shawn if he was involved in that case, his entire demeanor changed. His posture stiffened. His responses turned flat. And then he invoked his right to legal counsel, refusing to answer any more questions. It was a clear shift, and a frustrating one for investigators. With no confession and no physical evidence tying Shawn directly to the Shelton crime scene, police were stuck. They had their suspicions, but suspicions weren't enough to close a case. So they turned their attention back to Timothy Parlin. Based on that, detectives arrested Timothy as an accomplice. When questioned again, Timothy admitted to driving Shawn to Kathy's house. He maintained that he stayed in the car the entire time and claimed to have no idea what Shawn intended to do inside. He said he only learned something was wrong when Shawn returned on the bag. Still, Timothy confessed to pawning Kathy's jewelry shortly afterward, an act that legally and morally tied him to the crime. When asked about the Sheltons, Timothy's reaction was different. He didn't ask for a lawyer. Instead, he admitted that he and Shawn had driven to the house with the intent of stealing valuables. Once again, he claimed he had stayed in the car while Shawn went inside. That same pattern. That same story. In the end, Timothy was formally charged in connection with all three murders. As for Shawn, he was officially charged with Kathy Blair's murder. While detectives strongly suspected his involvement in the second crime, they lacked the concrete evidence needed to secure a second indictment at that time. The court decided that the two men would be tried separately. During his trial, Timothy maintained his innocence, but the prosecution argued that he had every opportunity to intervene, and chose not to. His silence, his involvement in pawning the stolen items, and his continued partnership with Shawn painted a damning picture. After several days of deliberation, they returned with a verdict: guilty on all counts. Timothy Parlin was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But if Timothy's trial was relatively straightforward, Shawn Kasser's legal battle was anything but. His confession was central to the prosecution's argument. After intense deliberation, the jury reached a unanimous decision. Shawn Kasser was found guilty of the murder of Kathy Blair. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, just like his accomplice.